The heavy iron gate of Fairhope Ranch creaked in the darkness of that early morning, sounding as if the dry Texas earth itself were groaning in deep pain. Rachel passed through it on foot, carrying a battered leather suitcase in her right hand and a small bundle of clothes balanced carefully on her left shoulder, never turning back to look at the life she was leaving behind. Far behind her, standing at the very top of the grand staircase made of imported Italian marble, her father was screaming into the chilly night air. He shouted her name with a piercing rage that echoed across the 500 acres of cotton fields that stretched out as far as the human eye could see in the dim morning light. He yelled that she would return to him, that she would come back crawling on her knees begging for his forgiveness, predicting that in less than one single year she would be broken, starving, and crying at his doorstep. But Rachel just kept walking down the long dirt road, her boots kicking up dust, her heart locked in a silent determination that no amount of screaming could ever shatter. Up ahead, waiting patiently on the shoulder of the deserted country highway, stood a thin young man wearing a faded, sun-bleached cowboy hat, his weathered hands gently holding the leather reins of a single horse. There was no luxury pickup truck waiting for her, no grand escort of ranch hands, and certainly no wealthy dowry to secure their future together. There was only Jacob, standing there with his eyes cast down toward the gravel, possessing the quiet humility of a man who knew he had absolutely nothing of material value to offer this wealthy girl except his own devotion. Next to him stood a beautiful dun-colored stallion, with a wild black mane that whipped softly in the steady West Texas breeze, a rugged heritage animal named Vortex. Rachel finally reached the edge of the asphalt, set her heavy leather suitcase down in the dirt, and did the only thing that truly mattered in that life-altering moment. She looked up into Jacob's tired eyes and smiled a genuine, radiant smile, and with that single look, she willingly let go of a multi-million-dollar inheritance that most people would spend their entire lives killing to possess. Her father was Harold Miller Vance, and during those prosperous years, he was widely known as the most powerful and influential agricultural tycoon in the entire western region of Texas. He was a stern, unyielding man who commanded a fleet of modern green tractors that each cost far more than a standard suburban home. A man who regularly sat at lavish dinner tables with high-ranking government officials and local politicians. Harold measured his own human worth exclusively in the number of overflowing harvest sacks his barns produced and the thousands of fertile acres listed under his family name. His land seemed to stretch from one horizon to the very edge of the next, and he was fond of repeating, with that dry, cold pride common among men who have never known the true agony of hunger, that every single cent of his immense fortune had been built solely by the sweat of his own brow. He repeated this grand claim so many times to the local newspapers and townspeople that he eventually came to believe his own words. And right there lies the very first great lie of this long story, because the vast fortune of the Vance family was never born from the sweat of Harold, but rather from the vision of another man who came long before him, a sacred name that nobody inside that marble mansion had the courage to speak aloud anymore. Rachel was an only child, raised inside the suffocating walls of that enormous ranch, completely surrounded by every luxury imaginable, yet entirely starved of genuine human warmth at the exact same time. She had the finest silk dresses, expensive seasonal vacations to European capitals, and a prestigious education at a private university in the city. But she also had a father who treated parental affection like a business contract, always written with hidden clauses and heavy emotional demands. Harold had spent years secretly planning to marry his daughter off to the eldest son of a wealthy neighboring oil and cattle magnate, intending to merge their vast properties and build a colossal agricultural empire that no one in West Texas would ever dare to challenge. He had every single detail perfectly mapped out in his cold mind, arranging his daughter's future exactly the way he meticulously planned a seasonal crop rotation. The only thing the powerful tycoon forgot to account for was the independent heart of his young daughter. Because on a warm Saturday afternoon, during a small-town rodeo festival, Rachel accidentally bumped into a quiet cowboy from the rugged hills who had come to Texas seeking honest work. Jacob did not attempt to court Rachel with grand promises of luxury or wealth, because he simply did not possess a single token of fortune to his name. He courted her the only way his mother had ever taught him, which was by offering her the absolute, unvarnished truth of who he was. He sat with her on the wooden bleachers and told her about the devastating droughts that had plagued his family's old homestead, about his father, who had passed away when he was just a young boy, and about his hard-working mother, who had raised 4 children by picking cotton in the scorching fields of strangers. He explained that he had traveled across the state line with nothing but Vortex and the clothes on his back, because selling that magnificent stallion was the one thing he would never do, even if he had to go multiple days without a single bite of food. When Rachel softly asked why that specific animal meant so much to him, Jacob looked out at the horizon and said that the horse was the only thing left from a grandfather he had never got to meet, a man his mother always described as the most honorable person to ever walk the land. When Harold eventually discovered that his only daughter was secretly spending her free time with a penniless ranch hand, he reacted the way proud, powerful men almost always do when their authority is questioned. He ordered his men to bring Jacob directly to the main plantation house, receiving the young cowboy in a formal dining room that featured a mahogany table far too long for a single man to ever sit at comfortably. Harold sat at the head of the table and coldly offered the boy a massive stack of $100 bills, a life-changing amount of money that would make any poor working man's legs tremble with temptation, demanding that he vanish from the girl's life forever. Jacob listened to the wealthy man's insults with his faded hat held respectfully in his hands, waited patiently for the tycoon to finish his long tirade, and then spoke in a calm, quiet voice, stating that he had not come to this ranch to sell anything, because a man's heart was not a commodity for trade. Harold laughed directly in the young man's face, a cruel, mocking laugh that cut deeper than a physical slap, and ordered him off his property immediately. The angry tycoon told Jacob that Rachel had been raised in absolute luxury and would not last a single month eating plain rice and beans in the broken shack of a common laborer. He bragged that when she inevitably came back crying and broken, he would personally lock the heavy iron gates of Fairhope Ranch directly in both of their faces. It was on that exact night that Rachel made her final decision, not out of the blind, reckless passion that often clouds the minds of the young, but because of a much deeper, profound realization about the true nature of her father. She looked at the wealthy man and saw a soul that despised the word of a poor man simply because of his poverty, and she understood that she had spent her entire youth surrounded by people who valued human beings exclusively for what they owned. She packed her single leather suitcase before the morning sun could rise, left her velvet jewelry box worth more than a suburban home sitting untouched on her mattress, and walked down the marble stairs. As her father stood on the illuminated portico, shouting curses and swearing by the memory of her late mother that his ungrateful daughter would return crawling in the dirt, the wheels of time began to slowly turn against him. In my many long years of traveling the open roads of this country, I have learned a profound truth that very few wealthy people are willing to believe. Animals can perceive the true character of a human being long before that person ever opens their mouth to speak. And that remarkable stallion, Vortex, had loved Rachel from the very first afternoon he smelled her hand. A true heritage horse is unique in that way. It chooses its true family, and once it accepts a person into its heart, that loyalty is cemented for the rest of its natural life. The tiny, weathered house where Jacob took Rachel was located on a small piece of leased land in the driest, most barren corner of the county, far away from the lush cotton fields, far from the polished marble, and far from the influence of her father's money. The small dwelling was built of old, weathered timber, with a cracked tin roof that allowed them to count the stars at night when the summer rains were delayed. It contained only a simple wood-burning stove, a creaking metal frame bed, and a small corral built of crooked cedar posts where Vortex spent his quiet nights guarding the perimeter. To the wealthy elite of the town, such a place would be considered absolute misery, but for Rachel, it was the first time in her entire life that she woke up to find the morning air entering through her window without demanding a price for her happiness. The first few months on that dry patch of earth were incredibly difficult, and I will not tell you any lies about how easy it was for her. Rachel, who had never washed a single porcelain dish or swept a floor in her father's mansion, had to learn how to cook over an open wood fire, how to milk their single dairy cow, and how to mend torn denim clothes by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. She wept silently on many dark nights, hiding her face in the pillow so Jacob wouldn't hear, not out of a single ounce of regret for leaving her wealth, but from pure physical exhaustion, which are two entirely different things. Meanwhile, Jacob worked tirelessly from sunrise to sunset, taking on the dangerous jobs of breaking wild colts at neighboring ranches, taking the jobs that no other cowboy in the county was willing to risk their bones for. On every single job he took, he brought Vortex along with him, because that stallion possessed a rare, inexplicable gift that the older ranch hands watched from afar with absolute amazement. Vortex had an innate ability to calm the most terrified, violent animals. He would walk calmly toward a wild colt that was foaming at the mouth with fear, stand perfectly still by its side, and within a few minutes, the wild animal would grow completely docile. The old cowboys whispered among themselves that the dun stallion must possess ancient, pure blood from the legendary foundation herds of the Old West, though none of them knew just how right they truly were. Harold, from the high tower of his grand plantation house, waited day after day for his telephone to ring, fully expecting his daughter to call out for emergency financial rescue. He fully expected the arrogant young cowboy to appear at his front gate with his hat in his hand, begging for a low-paying job just to survive. But the telephone remained completely silent as the weeks turned into months. The season advanced. The cotton crops grew tall under the summer sun, and down in the small timber shack, the quiet stubbornness of a poor man and the fierce courage of a wealthy girl were slowly building something that Harold had never managed to create with all the millions in his bank accounts. And during that exact time, high in the sky over the plains of West Texas, a massive weather pattern was beginning to form, far away at first, but moving steadily inward. A devastating phenomenon that every old rancher knows in his bones and fears from the moment he is a boy. The morning sun began to bake the earth with an unfamiliar, intense heat. The white clouds completely vanished from the horizon, and though no one realized it yet, the great drought was arriving. A historic drought never hits a country all at once. It arrives slowly, stepping softly across the land, and that gradual approach is the most terrifying part of its nature. First came the minor delay of the spring rains, which the local farmers dismissed as a common occurrence, confident that the downpours would eventually return to bless their fields. Then the sky transformed into a hard, brilliant shade of blue, completely devoid of a single cloud to offer shade from the relentless sun, and the old-timers looked up and read the grim sentence written above them. Jacob observed the changing sky morning after morning, standing beside Vortex with his eyes narrowed in that quiet, deeply rooted anxiety that characterizes men of the soil. But if the lack of rain was an inconvenience for a poor family who possessed very little, it was an absolute death sentence for a massive agricultural empire built on a foundation of sand. The entire empire of Harold Miller Vance was constructed entirely on massive monocure crops, plants that possessed an insatiable thirst for water and required constant, expensive irrigation to survive the summer heat. In that cursed year, the rains simply never arrived at all, and as the long months dragged on, the plains of West Texas, which usually resembled a vibrant green carpet stretching to the horizon, transformed into a pale, cracked, and deeply tragic desert. Harold's vast fields of crops grew weak and stunted, turning a sickly yellow long before they could ever mature, finally dying where they stood in the dirt, leaving millions of dollars of potential revenue rotting in the dry heat. The proud tycoon, who had spent his entire adult life measuring his personal dignity by the number of harvest sacks he sold, watched his entire life's work evaporate into nothingness alongside the very last drop of morning dew. The expensive green tractors and modern harvesting combined sat completely silent inside the dark garages, because there was absolutely nothing left in the fields to harvest. The local banks, which are always eager to be your best friend when the rain is falling and the business is booming, suddenly began to make cold, demanding phone calls to the mansion. The massive debts that had seemed entirely manageable during the prosperous years suddenly transformed into an insurmountable mountain of financial ruin that threatened to crush the family legacy. For the very first time in his long, arrogant life, Harold tasted the bitter, dry flavor of absolute terror in the back of his throat. In my long life spent traveling across the agricultural heartland of this nation, I have seen many great farming empires collapse in this exact manner. And I can tell you a truth I learned by watching the earth. The land has absolutely no pity for human pride. The soil does not respect a legal property deed, it does not care about a bank balance, and it shows no deference to a wealthy family name. The earth demands its payment from every human being equally. And those proud men who mistakenly believed they were the absolute masters of the land eventually discover that they were nothing more than temporary tenants. Harold discovered this ancient truth in the most painful way possible, forced to sell off his prize cattle at a fraction of their true worth just to keep the collection agencies from his door. The desperate tycoon was forced to fire loyal ranch hands who had worked by his side for over 20 consecutive years, putting his beloved heavy machinery up for public auction as the grand Fairhope Ranch slowly withered into a wasteland of broken fences and empty silos. The once powerful man lost weight rapidly. His shoulders hunched forward under the immense stress, and he aged a full 10 years in the span of a single summer. Yet despite his world crumbling, he refused to pick up the telephone to call his daughter. Pure pride is always the very last thing a man of that nature is willing to let go of. He will gladly surrender his land first. He will watch his money vanish. He will sacrifice his physical health. But his stubborn pride remains locked in his chest, pulling him down into the abyss. Down in the small timber shack on the leased land, the severe drought was also battering their daily lives. But it struck differently against people who had been born and raised to endure the hardships of the earth. Jacob did not panache or give in to despair. He simply did what his ancestors had done since the founding of the country, rationing their small well water, preserving every scrap of dry grass, and digging their water holes deeper into the creek bed. It was during this incredibly dark period that the stallion Vortex truly showed the world the magnificent purpose for which he had been brought into existence. While the expensive, pampered show horses on the wealthy estates were rapidly wasting away, requiring costly imported feed and pristine filtered water that was no longer available, that rugged heritage stallion remained completely solid and strong. He willingly consumed the dry, coarse scrub brush that the high-bred animals refused to touch, walking miles across the baking rocky soil, under the intense Texas sun, without ever showing a single sign of weakness or complaint. When the other horses on the surrounding ranches finally lowered their heads in total defeat, Vortex held his head high against the hot wind, his eyes bright with an ancient endurance, and kept moving forward. The desperate ranchers of the district, watching this incredible display of survival, began to actively seek out Jacob's small homestead, begging him to breed their surviving mares to his legendary stallion. The local cattlemen realized that they desperately needed the blood of an animal that could actually survive the harsh reality of a changing climate, and it was at this moment that the beautiful secret of Vortex's lineage began to unravel. To truly comprehend the remarkable events that followed in this story, you must first understand the true history of the incredible animal that Jacob rode through the dust. The heritage stallion was not just an ordinary horse. He was a pure descendant of the historic colonial Spanish horses that had first been brought to the American continent by explorers in the early 1500s. Those ancient war horses, possessing bloodlines from the old Iberian Peninsula and the rugged deserts of North Africa, had been released into the vast American wilderness centuries ago, where they were left to fend for themselves without human care, shadow, or cultivated feed. Out on the harsh, arid plains, The animals underwent the most brutal and beautiful process that nature can devise, which is the law of natural selection. Only the absolute strongest individuals survived the freezing winters and the scorching summer droughts. Only the horses that could endure prolonged hunger, severe thirst, and the relentless sun lived long enough to pass their blood down to the next generation. Over the course of 4 centuries, nature carefully sculpted a distinct breed of American horse, often referred to as the heritage Mustang or the vaquero horse, an animal possessing hooves so incredibly hard that they never required iron horseshoes. According to the oldest breeders in the country, these compact animals could easily travel 70 miles in a single day over sharp volcanic rock without ever injuring their feet or showing lameness. They were relatively small creatures, standing between 14 and 15 hands tall and weighing less than 1,000 pounds, making them appear completely insignificant next to the massive, pampered thoroughbreds owned by the wealthy elite. But within that small, muscular frame lay a deep reservoir of genetic endurance that no modern, artificially bred horse could ever hope to replicate. Modern agricultural preservation societies have documented that these heritage horses can easily survive by eating low-value weeds and drinking brackish water that would cause any ordinary farm animal to collapse and die within days. Furthermore, they possess an incredibly gentle and intelligent disposition, making them easy to train, and they display a remarkably smooth gaited movement that allows a rider to travel for miles across the country without feeling physical fatigue. In short, it was a horse that nature had designed with absolute precision to conquer the most devastating droughts the earth could throw at it. And it was this exact masterpiece of natural endurance that Jacob had tied to his crooked cedar corral, while the wealthy tycoons of the valley watched their expensive animals perish one after another. But there is a tragic element to this history that I must share with you, because it is an essential truth of our modern world. This magnificent heritage horse, which helped build the very foundation of our country, is now in danger of completely vanishing from the earth. According to recent data from national livestock preservation groups, there are very few purebred individuals of this historic lineage left in the entire country, and their numbers continue to decline every single year due to human neglect and a lack of organized breeding. It requires immense dedication, careful record-keeping, and passionate people to preserve this ancient bloodline before it is lost to history forever. Harold, during the highest peak of his immense wealth, had looked directly at that magnificent stallion and seen nothing more than a worthless, common pony fit for the slaughterhouse. The proud tycoon, who calculated the value of every living soul strictly in dollars and cents, was completely incapable of reading the priceless history standing right in front of his eyes. And that, my dear friend, is the most expensive form of blindness that can ever afflict a human being in this life. It was on one of those hot summer afternoons, with the local demand for the stallion's breeding services growing daily, that Jacob gently asked Rachel to come sit with him on the wooden porch steps. He reached deep into a weathered metal tin that he had kept safely hidden inside his closet for many years, pulling out a carefully folded piece of paper that was yellowed with age and nearly falling apart at the seams. It was the official, handwritten registry document for Vortex, detailing the long pedigree of the animal, written decades ago by an old-fashioned horse breeder in the rugged hills of New Mexico. Rachel took the fragile paper with a trembling hand, brought it close to her eyes to read the elegant cursive script, and felt the earth completely vanish beneath her boots. Because there, written at the very bottom of the document in the space reserved for the original master breeder who had carefully selected those bloodlines over a lifetime of devotion, was a name she knew in her bones. The name written on that paper was Arthur Vance, her own paternal grandfather, the honorable old man whose name had been completely forbidden from ever being spoken aloud inside the walls of Fairhope Ranch. I know the terrible weight of that kind of family silence. I have lived through long nights where a person suddenly discovers that everything they were taught as a child was nothing more than a convenient half-truth. And I can tell you that it is a deeply painful experience to to gather up the broken pieces of a family history that your own parents spent decades trying to hide from you. Rachel sat there in the fading evening light, clutching the fragile registry paper to her chest, as the immense scope of the truth began to wash over her soul. Jacob sat beside her and softly recounted the secret story that his own mother had whispered to him by the fireside when he was a boy. He explained that many decades ago, long before Harold became the wealthy king of the cotton industry, there was an older rancher named Arthur Vance, who was the true pioneer and builder of the original family estate. It was Arthur who had first cleared the wild Texas land. It was Arthur who had gathered the very first head of cattle, and it was he who had bred these heritage horses with a deep love and respect that became legendary across the state. But as Arthur grew old and frail, he was deeply betrayed by his own ambitious son, Harold, who used corrupt lawyers and fraudulent paperwork to legally declare his own father incompetent, seizing the entire empire for himself. The ruthless young Harold had brutally cast his own father out of the family mansion, treating the honorable old man like a stray dog that was no longer welcome at the table. Arthur had walked away from his life's work with nothing but the clothes on his back, and the one thing his son could not legally touch: a single heritage mare that was pregnant with the absolute finest bloodline from his herd. And it was from that single displaced mare, raised in absolute poverty by an old man stripped of his dignity, that the stallion Vortex had been born generations later. Rachel wept bitterly as she listened to the story, her tears falling onto the dry wooden porch steps. She wept for the grandfather she had never been permitted to know, and she wept for the grand lie in which she had been raised. She felt a profound mixture of intense anger and deep sorrow washing through her heart. But when she finally wiped her eyes and looked out at the corral, she was no longer the naive girl who had left her father's house simply for the sake of young love. She now carried a sacred mission in her soul, because she understood that the stallion standing in their yard was not just an animal that was saving them from financial ruin during the drought. He was the true, spiritual inheritance of her family. He carried the pure blood of the honorable old man who had built everything with honesty, the legacy that had been stolen by greed. And far away at Fair Hope Ranch, the corrupt son who had betrayed his own father was slowly sinking into absolute bankruptcy, completely unaware that his ultimate salvation was sleeping that night in a humble cedar corral, guarded by the very daughter he had cursed. The historic drought held its grip on the state for nearly 2 full years, and when the dark storm clouds finally returned to unleash the rain, they poured down upon a completely transformed landscape. Many of the massive, industrial plantations had been completely reduced to dust, and many of the wealthiest landowners in West Texas woke up to find themselves entirely ruined. But in the midst of that widespread agricultural devastation, a small, independent enterprise had begun to flourish, though the outside world had not yet taken notice of its quiet success. Jacob, possessing the relentless determination of a man who had spent his entire life learning how to survive the hardships of nature, had transformed Vortex into the most celebrated and sought-after stallion in the entire region. The smart ranchers who managed to survive the financial crisis had learned the hard way that pampered, imported horses could not endure the reality of the climate. They needed the rugged heritage blood. Every serious cattleman in the county now desperately wanted their mares to be covered by Vortex, eager to raise colts that would inherit that legendary resistance to heat and hunger. Jacob, who was a man of absolute integrity but certainly no fool, managed the growing business with exceptional wisdom and foresight, refusing to ever sell the stallion but charging a fair price for his breeding services. He carefully raised the young colts, selling them at premium prices to serious conservationists and ranchers who truly understood the vital importance of preserving the historic breed. With every single heritage foal that was born in that corral, a small piece of old Arthur Vance's honor was being brought back into the modern world. Within a short period of time, the humble timber shack and the small cedar corral were no longer large enough to contain their thriving operation, prompting Jacob to lease more land and eventually purchase their very first acreage with clean, hard-earned money. Rachel worked directly by his side, utilizing the expensive university education her father had paid for to manage the complex legal registries, the financial accounts, and the organizational structure of what was rapidly becoming a premier equestrian facility. What had started out as a desperate flight from tyranny in the dark of night was slowly and honestly transforming into a magnificent ranch dedicated to the preservation of the American heritage horse. It was not a massive monoculture empire built on debt and exploitation, but rather something smaller, more resilient, and deeply alive. It was an enterprise that possessed a genuine soul. In my humble opinion, as an old man who has witnessed many different ways that people acquire wealth in this world, I can tell you that this is the only kind of fortune that truly matters. Money that is obtained through betrayal and deceit will always rot the soul of the person who holds it, while wealth that comes from the sweat of your brow, the keeping of your word, and the compassionate care of the earth will always sustain you. It was on a brilliant, sun-drenched morning, the kind of clear day that only arrives after a long period of cleansing rain, that a battered and dusty old pickup truck slowly pulled up to the front gate of the new ranch. A frail old man slowly stepped out of the driver's side, and it took Rachel several long moments of staring through the sunlight to recognize the face of the visitor. When the realization finally hit her, a sharp pain shot straight through her heart, because the man standing at the gate was indeed her father, Harold. But he was no longer the arrogant, towering tycoon who had screamed from the top of the Italian marble staircase. He was a thin, broken old man, wearing worn-out clothes, holding a stained cowboy hat in his trembling hands. His eyes were deeply sunken with the profound exhaustion of a man who had lost everything he owned and had not slept a peaceful night in months. Fairhope Ranch had been completely repossessed by the federal banks. The thousands of acres had been sold off at public auction, and the man who had proudly sworn that his daughter would return crawling in the dirt was now standing at her gate, lacking the courage to even step onto her property. The two of them stood there in the morning breeze, separated by the wooden fence, locked in a heavy, profound silence that carried far more emotional weight than any loud argument ever could. It was Harold who finally broke the silence, his voice cracking with a deep humility that Rachel had never heard from him in her entire life. He openly admitted that he had been completely wrong about everything, that he had lost every single asset to his name, and then, in a soft whisper, he asked if they might have a job for him on the ranch. He did not ask to be treated as a father or a guest. He humbly begged for a simple job as a common ranch hand, from the very daughter he had brutally cast out into the cold. Rachel had every legal and moral right in the world to lock the gate directly in his face, exactly as he had promised to do to her years before, but she did not close it because she was not made of the same cold material as her father. She had been raised by the memory of a different bloodline, a legacy of true honor. Before she gave him an answer, she gently took her father by the arm and led him out to the main breeding corral, where the aging stallion Vortex was standing proudly in the sun, his mane catching the wind. Standing right beside the stallion was a beautiful young colt, possessing the exact same dun coloring and fierce, intelligent eyes, showing that the ancient bloodline was continuing to repeat itself in the new generation. Rachel reached into her pocket, pulled out the fragile, yellowed registry document that she had preserved so carefully, and placed it directly into her father's calloused hands. Harold adjusted his glasses and began to read the old paper, his eyes tracing the lineage until he reached the very bottom, where the name of the master breeder was written, Arthur Vance. The broken tycoon, who had lost his entire farming empire, suddenly felt his knees buckle beneath him as the full, crushing weight of the truth hit his soul. He had to grab hold of the wooden fence posts just to keep from collapsing into the dirt, and right there, the hard man who had never shed a single tear in front of another human being broke down into a violent, sobbing weep. He wept with the agony of a man who realizes the truth far too late in life, suddenly understanding that the magnificent horse he had despised and dismissed as worthless was the sacred creation of the father he had betrayed. He realized that the ancient bloodline which had saved his daughter from starvation during the Great Drought was the exact same legacy he had tried to erase from the earth. He understood that while he had been busy building a temporary empire on a foundation of stolen land and arrogance, the true, eternal treasure of old Arthur Vance had survived hidden in a poor man's corral, waiting for the perfect moment to bloom again. And he finally understood the ultimate irony of his life, that when he had shouted from his marble steps that a Vance would return to this family on their knees, he had been half right. A member of the Vance family had indeed been brought to their knees on that ranch, but it was not his courageous daughter, it was he himself, broken and humbled by the turning of the earth. Rachel did not leave him there in the dirt. She gently reached down and helped her father stand up, not out of a sense of weakness or pity, but from a position of true moral grandeur, which is an entirely different quality. She looked into his tear-stained face and told him that he could stay on the ranch, that there would always be a warm home, plenty of food, and honest work waiting for him. But she firmly reminded him that on this land, no human being would ever be judged by what they owned, but exclusively by how they treated others. She made him understand that the spirit of the grandfather he had cast out was the very thing providing him with shelter and sustenance in his old age. Harold humbly accepted her conditions, and he spent the final years of his earthly life working as a simple hand in the stables, quietly cleaning the stalls, grooming the coat of Vortex, and teaching the young foals to trust the gentle touch of a human hand. The local townspeople often remarked that during those quiet years spent working under the hot sun, cleaning the hooves of a heritage horse, Harold Miller Vance finally transformed into a truly decent, honorable human being. It happened very late in his life, true, but the important thing is that he finally changed. Old Arthur Vance never lived to see any of these remarkable events unfold, having passed away completely alone and impoverished in a small rented room many years before, never getting to hold his granddaughter or know that his life's work would save the family. But as an old storyteller who has watched the mysterious ways of this world for a very long time, I choose to believe that from some quiet corner of the heavens, the old man was watching over them. I believe he saw his courageous granddaughter rebuild with absolute honor what his greedy son had destroyed with arrogance, and he saw the beautiful horse he saved from the wreck become the ultimate salvation of the family. Surely he smiled that peaceful, knowing smile of a man who always understood that the great wheel of this world will always keep turning, and that it will eventually bring a precise, poetic justice to every single soul who walks the earth. And so, my dear friend, we have finally reached the very end of this long tale, and I want to leave you with the single most important lesson that this journey has carved into my own heart. Harold spent his entire life believing that true wealth was measured in real estate acres, harvest yields, and massive numbers stored in a corporate bank account. And he lost absolutely everything, because he built his life on a foundation of betrayal. Whatever a man attempts to build out of dishonesty and disrespect will inevitably crumble into dust the very moment the first great drought of life hits his home. Rachel chose a completely different path. She looked at the immense material inheritance her father offered, recognized the lack of soul within it, and willingly walked away with nothing. Her father died, believing she was a foolish girl who had thrown away a fortune. But he finally learned the truth while washing the hooves of that stallion. His daughter had not lost anything at all. She was simply wiser than all of them, choosing from that entire vast inheritance the only single part that possessed a living heart. She chose the legacy of an honorable man carried on the back of a horse the world considered worthless. And with that choice, she built a beautiful life that was truly worth living. I urge you to take deep care of the things that possess a true heart in your own life, and never measure the worth of a human being by the size of their wallet, but rather by the sacred integrity of their word. If the world ever tries to offer you a mountain of soulless luxury in exchange for a small, honest thing that possesses a beautiful soul, remember the brave girl from the plains of West Texas, and always choose the path of the heart. It has been an absolute joy sharing this afternoon with you, so please take care of your animals, cherish your loved ones, and may life always grant you a stubborn, resilient horse to pull you through the dry seasons.